Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this meeting as part of the TUC Congress. My name's Alex Mayer. I'm a former member of the European Parliament for the East of England, and also a proud member of the GMB and UNISON. And I'll be chairing today's meeting for the Labour Movement for Europe. So the Labour Movement for Europe is the pro-EU society that's affiliated to the Labour Party. We've got a range of speakers who will be talking to us throughout the next hour. We've got Mark Hendrick MP, who's the Labour and Cooperative MP for Preston and has been for the last 20 years and is a member of the International Trade Committee. We've got Allison Roche, who's a policy officer for UNISON. Hopefully joining us shortly is Fausto Durante, who's an officer for CGIL, which is Italy's biggest trade union. And we've got Jude Kirton-Darling, who is the Deputy General Secretary at industriAll Europe and a former MEP for the North East of England. So the format for our meeting is that we're going to hear from each of our panellists for 7 minutes, and then it will be over to you for any questions that you've got. I'm sure the vast majority of you are now very used to Zoom by now, but if you want to ask a question, the way to do that is to virtually raise your hand. You click on the Participants tab, which is normally at the bottom of the screen if you're on a PC, or at the top of the screen if you're using a tablet, and then you click on the button labelled Raise Hand. Feel free to do that at any time during the meeting. You don't have to wait till everyone's finished speaking in order to raise your hand. So, as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, a lot of UK employment law is derived from EU law, and they include issues that matter to all trade unionists. So working time, holiday pay, maternity rights, discrimination law. And as a member of the European Union, when we were, the UK couldn't reduce those rights below the minimum level that was set by EU law. And we in Labour and the trade union movement, we argued for these rights to be saved and included in the legally binding bit of our agreement with the EU. But Boris Johnson, he refused to do that. And that's regardless of the fact he now seems perfectly willing to ignore legally binding international treaties. So we'll be discussing that. We'll be discussing what the EU has done to improve workers' rights, what kind of a relationship with the EU the next Labour government needs to negotiate to protect workers' rights, and how the Labour Party can still work with our socialist partners in other European countries to improve workers' rights across Britain and the European Union. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Mark Hendrick, and he will start us off for 7 minutes. So over to you, Mark.
Right, can you hear me, everybody?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks very much, Alex, for the introduction. Actually, I'm speaking as well as a former member of the European Parliament, going back to 1999, when it was on first past the post, and I'm probably the only person here who's been elected to the European Parliament on first past the post. So got that proud achievement, if anything. Right, 3 topics for discussion: what the EU's done to improve workers' rights, what sort of Brexit deal this government is heading for and what it will mean for workers' rights, and what kind of relationship with the EU will the next Labour government have. Right, very quickly on the first topic, significant employment rights have been gained for UK workers as a result of our EU membership. Some have been mentioned: access to paid annual holidays, improved health and safety protection, rights to unpaid parental leave, maternity rights, discrimination protection, right to time off work for urgent family reasons, equal treatment rights for part-time, fixed-term and agency workers, rights for outsourced workers, rights for workers' representatives to receive information and be consulted, particularly in the context of restructuring. So these rights could be amended or reduced by domestic legislation, as we know, after Brexit, unless there are provisions about maintaining existing workers' rights standards in a future UK-EU agreement. And these EU's trade agreements with third party contain what are known as level playing field clauses on labour standards. And these clauses normally prohibit the parties from reducing their domestic labour standards in order to gain a trade advantage. The European Commission stated in 2018 that due to the UK's geographic proximity and UK-EU trade agreement, it suggested that the UK and EU should be prohibited from reducing workers' rights below levels currently set by EU law. Now, what's this Brexit deal heading for, if we get a deal at all, I should say? Now, a previous version of the withdrawal bill, which was published on in October 2019, contained clauses on the protection of EU-derived workers' rights, while the new European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill 2019 to 2020, published in December of last year, does not contain clauses on workers' rights. Now, that should be a concern to all of us. And in the December 2019 Queen's speech, it was announced that protection for EU workers' rights will be included in a forthcoming employment bill. Details of this bill have yet to be published, and there is no date available for a second reading. According to our library in the House of Commons, there will be the issue of removal of workers' rights in the new EU bill. Now, the Theresa May government's workers' rights bill appeared to be concerned solely with protecting workers' rights derived from the EU. Now, by contrast, the Queen's speech suggests that the Johnson government's proposed employment bill would cover a range of additional employment-related issues. Now, these include the creation of a single enforcement body for employment law, proposals for a single labour market enforcement agency to take action on behalf of vulnerable workers to enforce their employment rights. This proposal was found in every major party's election manifesto. There'll be the right to request a more predictable contract, workers on 0 hours and similar contracts to be given the right to request a more predictable and stable contract after 26 weeks service, tips to go to workers in full, extending redundancy protection to prevent pregnancy and maternity discrimination. Every major party promised to improve the protection of women who are pregnant or on maternity leave. Extended leave for neonatal care, another proposal that featured in all the election manifestos. A week's leave for unpaid carers, a feature of the Conservative manifesto as a part of the policies to combat workplace inequalities, and making flexible flexible working the default. So what kind of relationship with the EU want with the next Labour government? What do we need to negotiate to protect workers' rights? Labour's European policy will evolve towards the next general election in 2024. But meanwhile, Labour can't let the Tories blame the consequences on COVID-19 or Brussels. The rights of European citizens within the UK and British citizens in the EU must be defended. And the EU faces its own new challenges, COVID-19 creating borders within the Schengen area and far-right populism on the rise. The trade unions want government to go further than the commitments it has made and commit to keep pace with new EU labour laws in future. The logical place to commit to alignment with the future Labour government and rules is in the agreement on future trade with the EU, which will be negotiated over the coming years. But currently, protections are not in place. Finally, it's not just trade unions that care about labour issues. The EU member states care about it too, as they are concerned that the UK will seek to gain a competitive advantage by deregulating its labour market. That is a big danger, I think, with this Johnson government. I don't think there's any depths to which they wouldn't plumb. And I think, obviously, as trade unionists, we've all got to be vigilant and keep our eye on this government, because, as we can see from the current shenanigans over the withdrawal agreement, that nothing is beyond them. I'll leave it there for now, Alex, and obviously take any questions or move on to the next speaker as you wish. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, I've muted myself. So we'll be taking questions at the end. So we'll move now on to our next speaker, who is Allison Roache from UNISON. Allison, over to you.
Great, thanks, Alex. Yes, I was just going to start by saying that the trade union movement has obviously had 4 key priorities throughout these negotiations. Protecting obviously jobs and wanting the best for the economy out of the deal, but also protecting our equality and human rights and public services has also been important. And actually, some of the EU legislation that's been incorporated into UK law benefits workers, even though they're not actually called employment rights, or they're actually labelled as employment rights. And I was going to explain some of those as well, and the importance of what that means for other things outside direct employment rights. But as was said earlier by Mark, the UK has got its own laws and employment protections, and indeed it did have before the mid-1970s, when the EU began to strengthen its social provisions. So we wouldn't say that 100% we have derived all our benefits for workers from Europe, but what we would say is that Europe has definitely strengthened them. It's extended some of those rights into parental leave, work-life balance, family rights at work, and also discrimination at work has been strengthened largely by a lot of EU legislation, and health and safety. I'd also just like to have a caveat that whilst the trade union movement does believe that we have benefited from those laws, we have also had certain cases where actually recently the EU began to almost put business interests, their needs for fair competition above trade union rights to organise and collectively bargain. And we haven't been uncritical, and we've made it quite clear that we wanted to see the EU invest more in those social provisions and bring back the balance to trade unions and the right to organise and collectively bargain. On saying that, the strength of those rights has always been underpinned by the level playing field, which meant that each member state could not undermine any other member state by basically lowering workers' standards or terms and conditions or the right to collectively bargain. And that is the strength of the level playing field, because without that level playing field, then it would mean there would certainly be the race to the bottom, which is why we've all been concerned to maintain the level playing field in any future agreement with the EU. What I also wanted to say was that since the withdrawal agreement, we have asked for the future relationship to have non-regression clauses. In other words, that the UK would be bound legally in an international treaty not to regress on any of the rights we have already. And they could be environmental rights, equality rights, human rights as well, not just employment rights and protections. We also asked for the possibility of dynamic alignment, which would mean that if EU rights were uplifted and improved in the EU, then the UK would mirror that so that UK workers would benefit from that uplift. None of those clauses have been put in any of the agreements. And what we do know is that the reason why the government doesn't want to align or keep its alignment with the EU is because simultaneously, while it's been negotiating with the EU, it's been negotiating with Japan for a free trade agreement, the USA, it's been negotiating a free trade agreement, Australia and New Zealand. And what seems to be the logic for the government not to keep its alignment with the EU is because it doesn't want its hands tied when it does a free trade agreement, because it simply wouldn't pass. America certainly does not want all the restrictions and what it would consider regulations that we have in Europe. And in fact, the evidence is that the standards are much lower, workers' protections are weaker in America, and they don't want to be bound, certainly by other provisions, which I'll explain in a minute. What we do know is it's been a bizarre situation for trade unions. The TUC greatly requested for a variety of trade unions within their own sectors, if you like, and on thematic issues like public procurement or sustainability, to be represented on what were called expert trade advisory groups. And so quite a few of us who are leading on Brexit or trade deals, for example, were on these groups. We were given very little information, usually just presentations at that time, no agenda. And we weren't allowed to speak about the European Union and the trade negotiations. We were only allowed to speak about Japan or America. What we did glean was basically the UK was having a tough time, for example, in the American negotiations, because the government could not basically get an agreement on public procurement beyond the centre level of government. In other words, all local government procurement the Americans weren't going to give us, but yet we were going to open up all our public procurement to America. So we did write to the Select Committee who were looking at this deal, and we said it was completely unfair and unbalanced, and basically the government was selling off our public services and we weren't going to get the equivalent back. And anyway, obviously we would argue that public service should be kept out of these trade deals. So it's been very difficult to try and campaign on issues when we haven't been getting the information. What I would then want to talk about, just before I finish, is it's not just workers' rights. Public procurement at the moment has always been based on the European directive. And public procurement sets the guidelines of how you outsource or privatise your public services. There are all sorts of legislations, but the most important one is Article 18.2 in the European directive says that all contracts must respect collective bargaining, the right to organise, and ILO conventions, which the European Union has signed up to and the UK has indirectly. That is all going to be removed because that public procurement bill is called the Public Contract, UK Public Contracts, is actually going to be torn up in December when we leave, and it's going to be replaced. And what is it going to be actually replaced by? What they're going to do is remove all the social provisions that actually help workers. Under the EU at the moment, you can say this contract can be outsourced as long as you maybe have a living wage clause, or you have a plan to eradicate zero-hour contracts. All that detail will be removed. We will default to WTO, and those provisions are gone. So it's not just about employment rights, it's about other regulations that have supported the progressive benefits for workers. The second thing I'm just going to quickly touch on is GDPR. The general data protection rights is also another thing the government is refusing to align itself with. So it's not just a level playing field. They've also saying they're not going to align the public procurement, and they're also not going to align our data privacy rights. For workers, GDPR actually provides the only thing that's regulated to basically protect workers' data and how employers can use it. America does not want this right, so they don't have anything equivalent. They've had something called a privacy shield, which the EU 3 weeks ago said it was actually not adequate for European citizens. So what they're saying is it's not adequate because basically the government is not protecting our data. So the UK is basically shifting from the EU kind of regulations and moving to an American style regulation, and the evidence is there in front of us. And the internal market bill, and also the bill that's called the departure from retained EU law, are basically putting into legislation the government's need to control and take back from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, devolve bits of power, so that when they do these free trade agreements, which lower our standards, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales can't complain. It's really that obvious that is what's going on, and it's very worrying. So I don't want to end on a negative note. To be a bit more positive, we are working with the TUC, also with the Brexit Civil Society Alliance, 70 organisations around all these issues, and the trade justice movement, for example. We're working cross-party and also opposition MPs, but also trying to get those amendments in. It's really important. And also just trying to basically explain this is not about remaining, this is just about retaining our rights as we do any future deal. So I'll leave it there, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison. So we're halfway through our speakers. So just a reminder, if you're not a member of the Labour Movement for Europe, please join. If you're a member of the Labour Movement for Europe and not a member of a trade union, please join a trade union. So next, I'm really delighted to welcome all the way from Italy, our next speaker, Fausto Durante. He's a senior officer for Italy's biggest trade union. So over to Fausto.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm very happy to be here today, and sorry for my late linking to this meeting. But I had another web call for the future of steel industry in Italy. That's the reason why I was a little bit late. So coming back to the object of this meeting, to be very brief and very clear, we are really concerned about the potential impact and the possible effects of a no-deal Brexit on workers' rights concerning the rights of workers in UK, the rights of UK workers employed in European companies, and the right of European workers employed in UK companies in case of a no-deal Brexit. Because there are many different aspects that will affect the condition of workers if the Brexit will conclude in a no-deal. First of all, what we are really concerned about is the real willingness of the conservative government, because you have a conservative government, and we have never to forget this basic principle. We all know that conservative governments are not particularly, how can I say, they have not so much interest in workers' rights. The conservative government will take immediately the occasion to rethink or redraw UK legislation directly deriving from European Union laws and regulations and directives. Just to make some simple examples, many European rights, including the right to be paid if you are on holiday, the right to be paid if you are sick, the right to be paid if you are on parental leave, or the right to be paid if you are in a specific situation that national legislation does not include. Many of these rights are enforced by European law. What will it happen to UK workers if the conservative government decide to intervene in these kind of situations and will take away all these sets of rights in order to make, let's say, UK companies more competitive, more able to compete in the economic and global scenario? And in many respects, UK workers will be discriminated if there will be, as we are concerned about, a governmental intervention of basic social rights, which at the moment are not guaranteed by national law, but are guaranteed in force of a European general legislation. The UK government will feel itself free to deregulate, as we have seen in many individual EU countries when conservative or let's say, or populistic governments had the power. And it's not only the case of UK. We saw this kind of intervention in social and workers' rights legislation wherever popular party and populistic parties head into power in different European countries. What about holidays? What about sick pay? What about overtime? What about working time directives? What about health and safety? Many national legislations concerning health and safety are based on European rules directly incorporated into national legislation only in force of the European dimension of these laws. What about health and safety? What about the possibility of workers' representatives in a plant or in an office or in a workplace to be properly informed, consulted, and participate in companies' process if there is no national legislation regulating it? And another point we would like to highlight is what will it happen to the European companies and the multinationals with UK branches in cases of a European Works Council or a European company statute? There will be no more rights to be informed and consulted just because there is a no-deal Brexit today. If you are a worker in a multinational with a source of European dimension, you have the right to nominate your worker representatives into a body of European representatives, and you have the right to be informed, consulted, and where is the need to participate into the company process decision if you are a member of a European multinational. If you are out of this regulation, why the European Works Council will not apply anymore to UK workers? And this will produce new inequalities and new difference of treatments between UK workers and European workers or other countries' workers working for the same company. This is something that should be took into consideration. And finally, there is a general evaluation of what will it happen to UK in case of unfortunately no deal Brexit. UK workers will have to face a situation where new different inequalities will apply to them if confronted with workers of companies in European Union, which will still continue to have the same rights they had before. And this is something unacceptable from our point of view. We have no difficulty in defining ourselves in CGIL as a left-based trade union. And being a left-based trade union, we see equality of treatment and the same opportunities for all workers as a keystone for the future of workers' rights and the future of workers' situation across Europe. Nobody can understand in 2020 that such a process like a no-deal Brexit can significantly worsen the UK workers' situation. This is something we will always fight against, and we hope that also UK workers will find the ability to fight against this new form of discrimination and new form of inequalities if confronted with the rest of Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fausto. That was really fantastic. Just a reminder to everybody, you can start putting your blue hands up already, and we need some women to put their blue hands up as well, because I need some women to ask some questions. Last but by no means least, it's over to Jude for your contribution, please, Jude.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks very much to the other panelists. And I'm going to try and avoid that we all say the same thing with different voices and different accents. So I will adapt what I was going to say according to what's already been said before, because I agree pretty much with the analysis which has been made by the other speakers. Since Brexit, since the end of January, I left I was one of the last Labour MEPs in the European Parliament. I was also Labour's member of the Employment and Social Committee, Social and Employment Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, and the Trade Committee of the European Parliament. I had a break, and since the 1st of July, I've been Deputy General Secretary of industriAll Europe, which is European Federation for Manufacturing, Mining and Energy Workers right across Europe. And if I'd hoped that I was leaving Brexit behind when I left the European Parliament on the 31st of July, then I would have been very wrong, because it's really clear that now, and in the discussions that we've been having within the European trade union movement, now the concerns about what is concretely happening in the negotiations and what it means for working people on both sides of the channel are increasingly rising up the agenda. So all three speakers have set out the various ways that European workers' rights play a role in the UK, whether it's directly employment rights, whether it's equality rights, whether it's information consultation rights, and broader social security and other social rights. But I think it's worth going back just one comment on the beginning. Why were those social rights developed within the European Union? And the fundamental reason why social rights were developed within the European Union was to avoid unfair competition and a downward cycle and competition between workers within the single market. In fact, the first social rights in the European Union were the gender equality rights from 1957, which were about avoiding that women workers undercut male workers in the workplace, and equal pay was a fundamental part of the European Treaty of Rome. But if you take it forward, what's happened since Brexit, and many of my colleagues who've spoken have set out that historic mass of rights which has developed over the last 40 years. But since we voted to leave the European Union, actually there are new rights which have been developed within the institutions, and in part developed because the long-standing opposition of the UK government in the European Council was lifted once the decision to leave the European Union was taken, and there was a significant shift in the European Council after the vote in June 2016, which saw then a raft of European initiatives, whether it's the improvement of the working rights of posted workers. One of the last things that we voted on in the European Parliament was rights for 0 hours contracts workers, ensuring that 0 hours contracts workers and workers in the gig economy are compensated for cancelled shifts, have a clearer definition of their rights. More recently, rights for road transport workers and the mobility package, which we voted on as British MEPs, but is now being implemented across Europe to ensure better working rights for workers in the haulage industry and road transport workers across the board. And there are debates which are going on at the moment around the rights for platform workers and others. And that's why this whole discussion, which Allison was talking about whether we have a dynamic alignment to European standards or non-regression clause for European standards, is so important. Because the body of rights, as we all know, labour law, if it's static, it becomes obsolete because the labour market moves and employers find new ways, the worst employers I should say, find loopholes, find ways around the body of rights. Others find ways to improve the body of rights. If that body of labour law doesn't move with the labour market, then it loses its importance over time. And that's why it's so important that within any kind of deal with the European Union, there is a mechanism to allow the dynamic improvement of rights, because what we want to see, rather than what has been said, is very clearly the very big danger that we face, which is a downward spiral in rights, and the UK government deciding to deregulate employment rights, and a reduction in rights, which would then put pressure on our partners and colleagues elsewhere in Europe to also reduce their rights because of that negative competition. What we want to see as a European trade union movement is a lifting of boats and ensuring that solidarity between workers ensures an improvement of standards across the board. That is very definitely not the agenda of the Tory government. It's very clear, and the more you dig into the whole discussion, even in the last few days, about the internal market bill and the discussion about the Northern Irish Protocol, the Tories talk the talk about state aid, but this isn't about state aid. The debate isn't about whether the UK government can support industries more than the counterparts in the rest of Europe. This is a question about the level playing field, and the level playing field is about workers' rights. And the objective of that hardcore at the centre of the Conservative Party, Dominic Raab, Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, they have been explicit for years that their agenda is about reduction of workers' rights, but they can't say it as explicitly in the public debate because that would be unpopular. So they frame it in language which is less clear in the public debate, and talking about state aid feels like something very complicated, which not everybody really understands. If you're talking about watering down the Working Time Directive, people understand what that maybe means in more concrete terms than if you talk about differences in terms of state aid. And that's why the level playing field demand, which is a common demand from the British trade union movement and from unions on the other side of the channel within the European Trade Union Confederation and all of its member organisations, is such a fundamental demand which we must hold on to. The question is, what happens in the case of no deal? And I mean, we all have our view on what is happening at the moment in politics. I've been told that I'm overly optimistic. I still believe that there will probably be a deal, a trade deal, not a very good trade deal. And that trade deal will probably be as bad in terms of workers' rights as if there's no deal. So we need mechanisms to support each other within our trade union, our labour family across Europe, to ensure that we don't end up in a downward spiral of competition between each other in specific industries. Fausto mentioned that he's just come from a meeting about the steel industry. The steel industry is in an enormous crisis across Europe. 40% of the workforce are on short-time work or subject to redundancy notices. These industries, in the context of COVID, will become incredibly intense, the competition to keep work, if we don't have strong solidarity between trade unions. That solidarity has been maintained as best as possible in structures like the structures that Fausto was talking about, European Works Councils, the structures across companies to ensure that unions can talk to each other in the case of restructuring, and that there are channels of dialogue. We will need, as a union movement, as a labour movement, to invest more in those channels of dialogue in the case of Brexit than previously. The idea that we, as a movement, can withdraw and hide behind the Channel Tunnel and deal with our problems in the UK is fallacy. We need, as a union movement, to be investing massively in those channels of dialogue, not just within the TUC, but also within the TUC, but also within individual unions, because the challenges will come in companies, in sectors, and in very particular situations in the months to come. And we need to avoid that workers are pitted against workers and that we end up in that negative spiral of competition. And that really, our collective strength, is the only way that we will counter some of the agenda of that the Tory government has in store for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jude. So now it's over to you for any questions that you may have. I can see we've got a few already. So I'm going to take Carmen, Graeme, Kendrick and Gabriella in that order, please. So if you could unmute yourselves and perhaps tell us where you're from and which trade union you're in.
Can I speak?
That's good. Yep. So Carmen first.
Okay. I am a member of Unite, and I am a member of the Labour Party, and I also a member of the N25. And as you can guess from my accent, I am a European citizen. I don't have a British passport. But I always thought, and this is my question to Fausto, would it have been better to support Corbyn's idea of having very clear red lines, like staking in a custom union, getting a very soft Brexit deal and get it down, rather than to go for a people's vote when it wasn't a parliamentary number that will allow it, and ended up how we have ended, going down a cliff with no guarantees. Basically, we are at the mercy of the Tories. And this is my question as a European, as somebody member of the N25. I was terrified of the people's vote, I have to say it. It wasn't going to work, it was very clear to me, and now we are where we are. So how can we, stop the British government? And this is, again, another question. Why we are not taking the British government
you only get one question, I'm afraid.
Okay,
so, yeah,
fine. So that is a question.
Okay, Graeme next. Can I take your question, please? Graeme Ellis?
Yeah. Graeme Ellis. I'm the co-chair of Disabled Members. Many of the rights won by disabled workers have come directly from the EU or through rulings in the European Court when we've had to appeal to the European courts. We've now lost that right of appeal. It's not going to be long before this government dilutes the disabled specific rights. How is Labour going to work with the unions to secure new rights to work from home if required? For instance, for years we've been told there's a reasonable adjustment that's not been possible, but the pandemic has proved that many of us have and still continue to work from home. And how do we make sure that our rights, disability rights, are separate from workers' rights, but in many ways they enhance our ability to be in the workplace and shouldn't be separated from workers' rights? So how can we keep both sets of rights active and strong?
Brilliant, fantastic. Next, Kendrick, please.
Hi, Kendrick Fowler, the chair of United Community Farmers. My question is, will Section 44 of the Health and Safety Act be on effect once we leave the EU? And how can we ensure that workers have the right to refuse to do unsafe work once we've left the EU? Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. And next, Gabriella.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Thanks a lot. I completely agree with the analysis. I come from the University College Union in Leeds. There is no discussion whatsoever at the moment about the consequences of Brexit in my union, mostly because people are focusing on the challenging return to the workplace under COVID. I wonder if other unions here present are actually currently discussing any strategy in relation to even calling for a general strike in the case of a no Brexit deal situation, which, as you highlighted very clearly, will have dramatic consequences. Because I don't see any other way for challenging the Tory government at the moment. So any discussion about strategy and action at this stage, we're facing a really very serious situation, as very well expressed by Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got one more question, so I'll take that as well, and then we'll go over to the responses. So we've got Claire Hill.
Hi, I'm a retired teacher. I want to know, is there anything positive at all? Anything, because I'm pretty much in the depths of despair like everybody else. So, anything. That's it.
Okay. we'll do our best to cheer you up, okay. Claire. First of all, over to Mark, please. Mark, if you want to address any of those questions.
Yeah, right. I'll try and deal with them very quickly in the order they came. Actually, on the first one, ideally, I wouldn't have wanted any Brexit. I would have wanted us to stay in the EU, but obviously the referendum was lost, even though I think it was cheated. It was a cheat the way that it was won. But the fact is, I think most people accepted that it was going to happen. And the question is, how would it happen? I was one of those who was very strong on what we were calling Common Market 2.0 plus, which would have meant that we obviously left the political institutions like the Parliament, the Commission, etc., but would have stayed in the single market and the customs union, and would have had more of an arm's length relationship in a similar way, not the same way as Norway, but a similar way. And we could have maintained many of the benefits of the EU without actually being members of the EU. So that was my view, and I do take that approach, which many of my colleagues didn't, including our current leader, and we look where we are now. I'm not saying it's their fault, but the fact we were so disunited around the response to Brexit, I think meant that we had a weaker case when it came to trying to win things in Parliament. On the question of disability, and actually the third question as well, about people being forced to do work that's unsafe, clearly, you know, the party's position is such that we want to extend people's rights, enhance people's rights, and therefore, when that election does come, probably 4 years from now, obviously we'll have to do everything we can to make sure that we win that. But obviously, in the absence of a Labour government, there's very little we can do about that. On the question of a general strike, well, a strike is always the last option. You know, you try and negotiate, or you try and persuade and try and cajole. But we've got a government now with an 80 majority. So it doesn't really matter, other than to make the points we should be making, what the opposition says or does, because obviously the government will get away with what the government wants to get away with. And we've seen that with this government that's just so brazen in terms of their approach to dealing with interested parties and real people with major stakes in the economy, that they just don't care. And I do feel the fact that they're willing to transgress on the withdrawal agreement just typifies the nature of this government. I'm not saying a general strike wouldn't be called at some stage in the future if things got far worse than they are now. Having said that, I can't think how things can be worse with COVID-19 going on at the same time as they're doing their best to get a hard Brexit. But I do think it has a fair bit of way to go yet before we resort to a general strike. Anything positive, I think, was the last question. Not really. I can't remember a time in nearly 40 years I've been involved with politics that things have looked as bleak as this. I remember getting involved in the Labour Party during the Thatcher years, and it was really horrific to see what was happening then. If somebody would have said you'll spend the next 38 or 39 years of your life and things will be worse at the end of it, well, maybe I wouldn't have got involved in politics in the first place. But, you know, we've got to stay on the side of ordinary people and good people, and so we keep fighting and we do what we can. But even though there's not a lot positive to say at the moment, I'm sure at some stage in the future things will get better. I just hope I'm still around to see it. Okay, thanks.
I'm sure you will be, and there's always organising to do. That keeps us all entertained and enthusiastic. So next over to Alison, please.
Yes, thanks. I'll just quickly answer some of those, not all of those, so other speakers can comment as well. I was just first of all thinking what Judith had said, how really, one of the things that Theresa May had promised as part of her Brexit was we would have a social dialogue, a new kind of partnership between, you know, employers, employees, and civil society. And we've got to hold, you know, the current government to basically not to give us that, really. At the moment, they're actually doing the opposite. But I think it's really worth us pursuing some sort of social partnership. I was also then thinking about the employment rights bill that Mark had mentioned as well, which answers some of the questions that we've just thrown up. In that employment bill, there's a lot of opportunities for the trade union movement and the Labour Party to gather around with an alliance in the our colleagues from Europe, getting all those rights in. And it's not just getting those rights in that bill, but also an enforcement mechanism, because the government has recently consulted on departing from ECJ case law. And this links a bit into the disability protections as well. Basically, what it means is that any case law that's been made through the ECJ can now be challenged in the lower courts if this is passed. Originally, it was only with the Supreme Court, but they're trying to, they must think there's going to be loads of challenges. What's worrying for protecting our rights is it means the law already established can be unpicked. And it's not likely to be unpicked to favour and benefit workers. It's likely to be unpicked to basically get rid of red tape, regulation. I can think of just dozens of UNISON cases where we have relied on that. Whether it's the right to consultation for restructure, for example, that was only won by using the European human rights legislation alongside our the code that we're allowed to do that. So all that will get unpicked, and we've got to rally around preventing that as well. All the unions and TUC, I know, responded very strongly against that unpicking and that departure from ECJ law. So that there are going to be lots of basically campaigns where we have to, first of all, get our voice heard, really. It's not acceptable. You've already seen the internal market bill. It's upset a lot of, you know, Conservative MPs, a lot of civil servants who really are not happy with the idea that we're breaking international law, for example. And then I was just thinking, finally, I don't know about other unions, but UNISON has launched today. Dave Prentice, our General Secretary, launched the No Back to Normal campaign, which basically says, you know, we don't want to go back to undervaluing our public services and our public service workers. And we've also got a campaign to basically ask the government to fill the £10 billion local government underfunding gap. So there are campaigns out there. Please look at your union websites. And I know that obviously the TUC's got an overarching strategy of, you know, a jobs recovery post-COVID. So there are loads of campaigns out there for members to get involved, and you can write to MPs. There's lots of things that you can do. So please do that when you've left this meeting. Cheers.
Thank you, Alison. Lots of campaigns for everyone to get involved in. So next over to Fausto, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think that Corbyn was right when he suggested something innovative and apparently difficult to realize, but very fascinating in terms of working time reduction, in terms of protection of wages, and in terms of a different economic and social and cultural approach to the globalization and to the future of the workers and the idea of work in this unfair society. I think he was right, and I had the impression that we lost at the European level, and when I say we, I mean progressive parties and left-oriented trade unions. We lost the opportunity to open a public and European-wide debate on working time, on working time reduction, and on the situation of wages in these very unfair and unequal Europe. But concerning the concrete impact of a no-deal Brexit on workers' rights, and this is something we are very worried and concerned about. I just want to list a number of points we should take particularly care about. Working time directive, for instance. We all know that UK governments, different UK governments, always challenge the impact and the effect of working time directive to the European Court of Justice. And the same happened with collective rights, including the consultation, the workers' consultation. We all know that UK law has no clear duties about workers' consultation in case, for instance, of redundancies, of transfer of undertakings, of restructuring and something like that. The EWC directive, the European Works Council directive, I mentioned it in my previous intervention, and as well the set of rights for workers defined in the Information and Consultation Directive of 2002 from European Union. And these two was always opposed by UK. The Temporary Workers Directive, the Work Equipment Directive, particularly important in this period of coronavirus, the protection of pregnant workers, the right to maternity and paternal leave, the protection of part-time, fixed-term and agency workers, the protection of night workers. There are a lot of rights for workers in the UK. And this is our concern. In European Union, if this Brexit process will end with a no deal, many companies or many employers' organization will be tempted to use the Brexit, the no deal Brexit case, to worsen workers' rights throughout Europe. So it's not only a problem for UK workers, it's a problem for the workers all around Europe, within or not within the European Union. And UK will be tomorrow out of European Union, but will remain a very important economic system within Europe. So I fear that many companies and many employers' organizations will take the opportunity to use the no-deal Brexit in order to reduce workers' rights in other different European countries. Is it time for a general strike? I don't know. I think that it is time for a European day of action in order to oppose and in order, let's say, to give UK government a clear message. And I think that the European trade union movement, the European Confederation, as well as the European sectoral federation, Judith is here and she can surely talk about what the industrial union across Europe are thinking about. I think that it's time that this level of European trade unionism give a clear message, not only to UK governments, but to all governments throughout Europe, not to use this Brexit case to reduce workers' rights, because at the opposite, we need to improve and to increase workers' rights in this era of pandemic on one side and of uncertain future of globalization and on worker situation on the other side. That's what we think in Italy, and that's what we want to point out to the European trade union movement.
Thank you, Fausto. Just before I move on to Jude, just a quick plug for Labour Connected, the replacement for Labour Party conference, where the Labour Movement for Europe will be running 3 webinars. So if you're enjoying this one, details about our next 3 sets of webinars are in the chat. So next over to Jude, please.
I think, especially since we're running over already, that there's not enough time for a full pitch, post-pitch analysis of the election result and why it went the way that it went. But I don't believe that it's as simple as to say that the people's vote meant that we lost the election. I think that would be really oversimplistic. And I think what is interesting is in the context of COVID, as Fausto was saying, of the Labour Party's agenda in the election, in our manifesto on other questions, actually some of those themes are now becoming mainstream themes of discussion across the whole of Europe. The 4-day week is now a negotiating platform for trade unions in a large number of European countries as a result of the COVID crisis, how to deal with COVID. Equally, the question from Graeme about the rights for disabled people, the provision for telework and how people can be working from home in a more long-term perspective is now very, very standard in negotiating kind of rounds of different trade unions right across Europe because of the situation that we're in. And potentially, if it's done right, we could leave this crisis, in the best case scenario, we could leave the crisis with a more diverse workforce where people, actually their working conditions are more adapted to their abilities, their capacities, rather than their skills, in relation to some of the innovations that we've been forced to do because of COVID. So I think that, you know, that comes back to Claire's question, is there something positive? I'm an eternal optimist, despite having been a Labour MEP through the whole Brexit debacle, which would normally have sent me into massive depression. I am an optimist. I think there are things to be optimistic about. I think some of it is about the way that the debate about how COVID is managed is shifting the social and economic debate, and we have to make sure that we put momentum behind that debate so that we don't return to business as usual, which didn't work for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And the other positive thing is that we have a government that may have an 80-seat majority, but the one thing that they know how to do is U-turn. And when the public rise up, they do it very, very quickly. And I think, you know, the Labour movement should learn from our young people and the exams debacle to actually demonstrate. We need the public now to be mobilised to demonstrate why these rights are so important, and it is possible to bring it down. Sometimes the whole debate about the EU has been overcomplicated by people. It's filled with jargon and it's filled with technical language, and it doesn't have to be. If we boil it down to the very bare bones, we're talking about the most basic rights at work, the most basic equality rights, the most basic health and safety rights, the most basic rights in terms of participation in society. If with those rights, we can mobilize a large majority of the population organized in different parts of society. And I think, you know, there's a challenge there for the British Labour movement, the Labour Party in Parliament, and the opposition parties in Parliament, together with the trade union movement, to actually explain in much more clear layman language why it is so important to defend these rights and to avoid a rollback. Because I think we'll find that, as with the exam results and as with some of the other U-turns that the government have been forced to make, that 80-seat majority might not be as solid as some in the Conservative Party think it is when their constituents are concerned and knocking on their doors. So I am still positive despite it all, and I still maintain that I don't think that no deal will be the final result of this. If it is, it will be by accident and not by design. I think what we're aiming for is probably a bad deal. And that's a challenge also for us as a Labour movement, of how we respond to a bad deal when it comes out of the sausage machine of the negotiations. Either way, we are going to need solidarity across borders. We are going to need the British Labour movement in workplaces, in politics, actively engaged in building dialogue and connections with brothers and sisters across Europe. And that need is only going to grow into the future. So I guess you know, international solidarity and internationalism will be our only route to any success, in my view, in the future.
Thank you so much, Jude. So clearly there's lots of crises at the moment, but I think we on the left know that when there's a crisis, there's opportunity there as well. We've got COVID crisis, Brexit crisis, climate emergencies, you name it. So we've got to stick together, show solidarity, stand up for our internationalist principles, and stand up for workers' rights. So a huge thank you to our speakers, to Mark Hendrick, to Allison Roche, to Fausto Durante, and to Jude Kirton-Darling. A huge thank you to all of you for joining this meeting. Have a look at the things that are in the chat, and keep campaigning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining, and goodbye. Thank you.